The Game Time podcast is sponsored by Matt Gaddis at State Farm. Whether it's your car, home, or renter's insurance, Mac's got you covered with fast, reliable service and a personal touch that you can trust. His info is on screen right now, so reach out today and see why so many people rely on Matt Gaddis. Big thanks to Mac for supporting the Game Time podcast.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is your guy, D. Cott, again with another episode of Cots Corner. I've got a special guest with me today, Mark Montieth, legend, Pike High School graduate, writer, author, Pacer beat writer, and all those other things, savant of Indiana basketball. So welcome to the show, Mark. We appreciate you being here.
It's good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Good deal. So I've got so much I want to cover, Mark, but I'm going to go in chronological order, and I'll just tell you right now, I'm going to use the Pacers for last. So I want to start with your book, Passion Play, that you wrote with Gene Katie. One of the things I've talked to my sponsor about, Matt Gaddis, we talked about this book, and he talked highly of you as well. And he says, it was sort of like the Bob Knight Season on the Brink book. So I want to get a little bit of the genesis of the book, how things went, and can your take on the Passion Play, and also your relationship with Gene Katie.
Yeah. I guess that book was kind of inspired by A Season on the Brink. John Feinstein's book with IU. The idea of having inside access to a major college basketball program was really appealing to me, and Purdue, was poised to have a great season that year, with the seniors Troy Lewis, Todd Mitchell, Everett Stevens, and I brought it up to Gene, and he was all for it. And I didn't have a publisher when the season began. I had some communication with an agent who was going to try to get a publisher. And then that agent got out of the business or got a different job or something at some point. So I kind of went through the season without having a publishing agreement, but I got a fair amount of publicity about my project during the course of the season. And that attracted a publisher from Chicago, Bonus Books. They're no longer in business, but they published the book. And it turned out great. It would have been a lot better. It would have sold better if Purdue had gotten to the Final Four or won a national championship, but they didn't, and it still turned out to be a great experience. They won the Big Ten, and it was just a great learning experience for me. Doing that kind of gives you it's like a graduate course in college basketball. You learn so much from the inside when you see more than the games, when you're going to the coaches' meetings, when you're at every practice, when you're in the locker room, when you're traveling with the team, all of that, you get such great insight into it. So I really enjoyed the project. Writing it, it was a long summer. That summer of '88, I still remember there was a drought. It was really hot. It seemed like every day you didn't want to go outside, and I got on a schedule where I was writing it at night. And I'd be up all night, go to bed about 6 a.m., get up in the afternoon, eat, go back to work. It was a lot of work, but, looking back, that was only a few months of my life. And I'm glad I did it. And the great thing about a book is that it has a shelf life. Nobody remembers really a newspaper article for long, or even a magazine article, or what you say on the radio or whatever. But a book, people still read that book. 1988, it's an old book, but people read books from way back all the time, and so I still get comments on it, and it still sells a little bit. 2 years after it came out, I bought up the remaining copies from the publisher. And so I had control of that, and I sold a decent number of those. So it was really an enjoyable project and a great education for me too.
Awesome, good. I'm glad to hear that. You spoke about Everett Stevens. A lot of people don't know he played a little bit with the Pacers.
Yeah.
So do you remember? How do you remember Everett Stevens as a player under Gene Katie? Then turning to be a professional. Remember that team was, I think it was Troy Lewis driven, if I remember right. So
Yeah.
talk a little bit about Everett Stevens since he was a Pacer, what you know about it, and how's he doing to this point?
Yeah. Troy Lewis was the best known player, from Indiana, Mr. Basketball, the highest scorer on the team. But I always felt like Everett had the most NBA potential because he was so athletic. And Everett is the most charismatic athlete I've ever known. I mean, just
Really?
a great guy, always happy, making jokes, just a good-hearted guy. And he did play 1 year with the Pacers. He was drafted in the second round by Philadelphia, and the Pacers traded for him. And he had 1 year with them as a backup guard. And that was it. He wound up playing in Australia for like 10 years and had a nice pro career there. Though wasn't quite uh, ready for the NBA, I guess. He did have a brief, maybe a 10-day contract with Milwaukee, I believe.
Okay.
And that was the extent of his NBA experience, but he still had a good career overseas. And Everett today, at least as of last winter, was living back in Lafayette and driving a bus and
Wow.
really enjoying it, from what I'm told. So like a shuttle type of bus within the city. His son played at Purdue for 1 or 2 years and wound up transferring out to Nevada. But Everett, and his wife, who kind of his college sweetheart, um, they moved back to Lafayette when their son was playing there, and they've stayed. And I believe he's still there. And from what I'm told, really enjoys what he's doing. He's got great people skills. He just, you can't help but love Everett Stevens. And he was a really good player on that team. He gave that team great athleticism and could play at both ends of the floor. Maybe not quite strong enough for the NBA, but he was a great college player.
Yeah, I definitely remember that time. That was a good time. I remember Troy and Delray Brooks around that time coming, one going to Indiana, one going to Purdue along with the year prior to that was Alford. So that's pretty interesting to see how all of that, shook out and everything and how those guys played out. And then you having, memory of these guys and still having knowledge. That's pretty good. So to staying on Purdue, Gene Keady, right? The legend himself, he'd be a larger than life presence if it wasn't for a guy down in Bloomington.
Yeah.
Give me a couple of stories that our viewers and our listeners would really like to hear about Gene Keady that they may not hear, say, in a normal city.
Yeah. Gene Keady was a really down to earth guy. Still is. I mean, he's still with us, but he would be a rare college coach, I think, who would have benefited from having a bigger ego. Most successful college coaches, they're like emperors in their little kingdom, and they can become egomaniacs, really powerful. And Gene was never like that. And I always thought he might have been better off with a bigger ego, would have had a little more confidence, might have recruited better, that kind of thing. But a real down to earth guy and just a good basic guy who grew up humble circumstances in Kansas, and an easy guy to get along with, an honest guy. He and Bob Knight had an interesting relationship. When I was there that season, the 87, 88 season, Knight, as he often did, had a lot of controversial things going on. And, Keady would say a lot of things about him. And there are things in the book about it. Knight had pulled his team off the floor in an exhibition game against the Russians that year. And, Keady, like a lot of Big Ten coaches, I think resented Knight not going to the Big Ten meetings or just kind of putting himself above others in the conference. But he certainly respected Knight's success. And after they both retired, they got along just fine. But, I know Bob Knight was the type that once you started beating him, or if you were kind of equal to him in wins and losses, he wasn't likely to be your friend anymore. Knight always stuck up for the bad coaches in the Big Ten and how they should keep their job because he knew he could beat them. The really good coaches, he wouldn't be that close to. And so they had a, kind of a distant relationship when they were both at the peak of their game. Knight and Keady did, but later on got along just fine. But Yeah, Katie, fiery. Everybody knows how fiery he was. And it wasn't just during games, it was every practice, every meeting. That's who he was. A lot of head coaches, particularly really successful ones, including Bob Knight, will sometimes just sit and watch practice and let the assistant coaches do it, take a more passive role. They might go out and recruit and skip a practice, that kind of thing. Gene Katie was the leader of every practice. He was fired up every single practice. And he had a great ability to get after players. He had a knack for chewing out a player, but not inspiring resentment. The players had a saying about him that he can chew your ass and make you like it. And that's true about him. He'd get after you, but the way he did it, you didn't get mad at him as a player. He might compliment you while he's yelling at you. Like, come on, you're 10 times the player he is. Don't let him beat you to the board, that kind of thing. Come on, you're way too good for that to happen, that kind of thing. So he was really good at yelling at players. Now, I do think that he sometimes got too emotional during games. And there's a saying about he'd step over the fight instead of stepping into the fight. I think he wasn't a great strategist as a bench coach. And I made that comment in an article one time, and he didn't like it. We talked about it a little bit, but I believe it's true, and others do too, that he relied on his assistant coaches to handle a lot of the X and O stuff. That wasn't his thing, and that's okay. Every coach, like every player, has strengths and weaknesses, and Katie's strengths were motivation, this fundamental play, that kind of thing. But he wasn't really an X and O guy. He had a system that worked, but he wasn't the guy to drop a play on a sideline, that kind of thing, or during a timeout, you get a basket that way. Matt Painter's really good at that. His assistants, Kevin Stallings and Bruce Weber, were good at that. It wasn't his thing, but that's okay. That's just the way it goes. But I really enjoyed being around him. I've been able to maintain a relationship with him over the years. I haven't talked too much lately. His current wife kind of keeps him away, I think, from some people. And he's got, some dementia now. He's up there in years, but a beloved guy in Lafayette. And you aren't going to find too many players who didn't like playing for him. Now, there probably are some. No coach can coach as long as he did and not have a few players that, this didn't work for him. I know Bob Knight has players like that. You have private conversations with Bob Knight. They're going to have some complaints about him privately. You don't hear that nearly as much with Gene Katie. He just had a knack. He got the most out of his players, and there might have only been one team of his that did not achieve its potential. I think maybe his greatest quality was he had more teams that surpassed preseason expectations than any other coach. He had teams picked to finish 8th or 9th in the Big Ten. They won it. That happened in 1984. Other teams, picked to finish middle of the pack, and they'd share the title, that kind of thing. So his teams and players nearly always achieved their potential and exceeded expectations.
Good. You like to hear that right from afar. So to flip that from the north side of the state to the southern part of the state, you just mentioned Bob Knight. One of the things about Bob Knight was, polarizing. You've got players that would say they would die on a hill for him with one bullet left. Then you've got some players that say, I want the shot at him. So give me a little bit about Coach Knight and, the years of his winning. Of course, obviously in the 70s and 80s and in the early 90s, but then how things kind of changed a little bit after that big class with Calvert, Chaney, and Grew and Henderson left. Talk a little bit about the pantheon of Bob Knight and what you saw in him as a leader and as a coach and realistically the figurehead of the state of Indiana.
Yeah. I went to IU and I covered the basketball team for the student paper there. And in a way, my timing was bad, and in a way, it was really good. It was the 76-77 season. That's the only season his team did not go to a postseason tournament. A year after they won that national championship and went undefeated. And 5 guys quit the team either before, during, or after that season. So it was tumultuous, to say the least. 2 guys quit during the season.
Wow.
And Mike Bidet and Rich Valavicius. So you know things are going bad if somebody's quitting during the season, and you couldn't transfer then like you do, like you can now. So
flexibility now.
You know, I covered that team for the student paper, and it was a great journalistic experience. And I got along with Knight okay. You know, I whenever somebody would quit and leave or whatever, I'd talk to a former player and try to get perspective and help people understand, you know, what it was like there, the good and the bad. And we, you know, turned out okay. He kicked me out of practice one day because he was mad at what somebody else had written in the student paper, which was kind of silly to me, but that's who he was. You know, obviously a great coach, really smart guy. You know, people often compare Knight and Katie. I always thought, you know, if you're going to go hear a speech, you'd rather hear Knight than Katie. But if you're going to sit down and have a beer with somebody, you'd rather do it with Katie than Knight. I mean, Katie was much more down to earth, less egotistical, but Knight could be really entertaining and a really smart guy. And he treated me okay, but you had to long-term kind of pay a price to have access to him. He wanted you with him or against him, you know, and
no in between.
As a journalist, you can't be that way. You know, you're there to cover a team objectively and write whatever's going on. I wasn't a columnist. I didn't write too many columns about him, so I didn't have occasion to issue opinions. But he, you know, he wanted you in his corner where he might do little favors for you now and then, give you information, but you could never say anything negative about him. And that might even include quoting a player who said something negative about him. You know, he really wanted to control the media. He really worked at manipulating the media, which to me is just insecurity. But that's who he was, you know, and he really did work hard to manipulate. And I even heard him joke about it at times. But it was interesting, and it was a lot of fun covering the Purdue Indiana games throughout the 80s and early 90s. And, you know, Knight, he was Jekyll and Hyde is a cliche, but he could be a real charming guy. You know, when he got in front of the national media, he would turn it on and make jokes, and was just great. But at other times, boy, look out. There was a dark side to him. I thought there were times he enjoyed embarrassing somebody. If somebody nervously asked a bad question in a post-game press conference, he'd embarrass them, that type of thing. So, you know, there were 2 sides to him. And I've gotten to know his son, Pat, pretty well. And Pat's a much different personality. And Pat talks about how his dad, you know, kind of realized he could have done better with the media, that it didn't have to be as abrasive as he was, that sort of thing. But, you know, Bob Knight was an only child who was kind of spoiled by his mother and grandmother. And he reflected that. You know, he was in a lot of ways a spoiled kid with a temper and a very high IQ. And that was a very combustible mix.
Interesting. You know, you see that from afar, and you do a lot of guessing, right, Mark? A lot of people are on the outside looking in, not really sure, but they just see what they see on television and kind of what some have said about him, and they form an opinion that way. So when you were there, I'm sure you like you say, he kicked you out of practice, and you probably thought at that time, you're a young guy, you're probably like, you know, I'd like to take you out back and give you one of these knuckle sandwiches. But what kept you there, and what kept you in a place of humility, doing your job, and understanding the moment that you were in with such a legendary, not just coach, but personality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you know, as young as I was then, a college student, and then in my 20s and 30s, I just enjoyed being around the game. I love covering the games, and a coach like Bob Knight to me just made it interesting. He wasn't going to hit me, I don't think, and he wasn't. If he kicked me out of practice like he did, that didn't really hurt my feelings. I played high school basketball. I got yelled at by coaches before, so I didn't care about that. I just enjoyed the whole thing, and I didn't. The things I saw or whatever, some of it seemed crazy to me, but it was interesting. Driving down the games in Bloomington at times, you never knew what was going to happen. Boy, he might pull his team off the floor. He might throw a chair. I was there for the game. He threw the chair. You just never knew. And there was kind of a perverse drama about it that you look forward to. You just never knew. And Purdue games were different. Gene Katie, while he was emotional and yelling and everything, nothing that crazy ever happened. But there was just a different element to the games at IU when Knight was coaching there. And in a way, I enjoyed that. It was just like I covered the Pacer game at the Brawl up in Palace of Auburn Hills. And I'm glad I was there. I would have hated to miss that action. If you're a reporter, you want to be where the action is. And same thing with covering IU basketball. I didn't really care what he did. There were times I felt bad for the players, but to me, it was just interesting and often exciting. I'm not hearing you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that must be.
Okay. I do want to talk about the Brawl, but before I do that with the Pacers, I want to talk about the Hall of Fame. Your reporting just this past week about Jay Edwards. Listen, brought tears in my eyes. Saw him from Marion High School, co-basketball, Mr. Player of the Year, Mr. Basketball, and then his time at Indiana. Talk about Jay and give the listeners something about Jay Edwards that they don't know.
Yeah. I didn't know Jay when he played at IU. Now, his freshman year at IU was the year I was doing the book at Purdue. And so I saw him play then, but I had no connection with him. I never talked with him. I think the first time I ever talked to him was at the pre-draft camp when he entered the NBA draft after his sophomore year. But when I had my radio show back in the days at 1070 one-on-one, I worked hard to get him. I got a number for him somehow. Somebody in Marion gave me a number for him, and he was living in Mississippi at the time.
Wow!
Like working on a crew laying pipe. And I got him on the phone. And there's one time we agreed that I would call him like at 6 o'clock on a Sunday night, and we would record a show. But then he didn't answer the phone, and that happened 2 or 3 times where he wouldn't answer the phone. I couldn't get him. And the next thing I knew, he was in Florida, and he called me one time and was talking about doing a book. And he was just out there and had nothing really stable going on. And then he moved back to Marion. And I kept connecting with him, kept calling him or whatever. And I finally got him to agree to do a show with me. And I drove up to Marion and drove him back to Indianapolis to record the show in the studio because he didn't have a car at the time. And I liked Jay. People know he had drug and alcohol issues, both at IU and later. He had a long career in the CBA and other leagues trying to make it to the NBA. He played 1 year with the Clippers, or part of a year with the Clippers, but kind of down and out. But he's a really likable guy, a really honest guy. You had that sophomore season at IU was unbelievable. I mean, there were 3 Sundays in a row he hit a game-winning or what appeared to be a game-winning shot at the buzzer. He beat Purdue with one. He beat Michigan with one. Then he hit one against Illinois that Nick Anderson came back and trumped. Yeah. But, you talk about ice water in your veins, he just seemed so cool out there and such a great shooter. And he was a guy who didn't seem fazed by Bob Knight. If anything, Bob Knight was, afraid of Jay Edwards. He let Jay get away with a lot to keep him on the team. And he didn't yell at Jay a lot because he knew how badly he needed him. And certainly their relationship suffered after Jay left. Jay didn't go and talk to Coach Knight about it. He just left. And there were times when Coach Knight wouldn't talk to him or didn't want anything to do with him. But, Jay, if you get to know him, is just he's got a certain charisma about him, and he could do different things if you just kind of get stable and kind of get everything together. I hear that he has been kind of the radio color commentator for Marion high school games and does a good job with that. And I don't know what else he's got going right now, but he had called me a couple of years ago when he didn't get into the Indiana Basketball Hall of Fame. Somebody had finally nominated him. One thing people need to understand is that they can't bring you into the hall until you're nominated, until they get a form. And nobody had done that for Jay until a couple of years ago. And when it didn't happen, Jay called me to complain about it. And I said, well, just hang in there. I think you'll get in someday, but people don't know where you are. They don't know what you're up to. You're kind of a mystery. People know about the issues that you've had, but you obviously were a Hall of Fame talent. So just hang in there. I suggested that he be more visible, go to the annual golf outing that the Hall of Fame has, or, be out there where people could see you. And he said, I don't want to do that. I'm not a politician. But finally he got in, and it was great to see. I called Jay the morning they announced it, and he was really happy about it. And I'd like to go to the banquet because I want to hear his speech. I'm curious, what he's going to say on an occasion like that. But, I think he's doing okay. Doing okay. Obviously, Jake grew up in Muncie, and his parents divorced, and he went with his mom to Marion. She got a job in a factory there, and he was kind of raised, a single mom situation. And I think there was kind of a history of drug, alcohol issues in the family. A lot of people don't know Jay has an uncle, and I can't think of his first name, but the last name is Edwards, who is an actor who was in the movie Patton, and had some other roles too, pretty well known as kind of a role player in Hollywood. And, Jay, I could see, not becoming an actor, but he could do a lot of different things if he had the confidence and so forth to do it, because he's got a certain aura or charisma about him, I think, that people would gravitate to. It was interesting for me to see the reaction to Jay getting in, because people really like watching him play, and they like him, and they want him to do well. And there's really a great outpouring of support for Jay getting into the Hall. And he's got a really great relationship with Lyndon Jones. They were the backcourt together at Marion, and best of friends. And they certainly got in different directions. Lyndon has a great job with Cummins Engine, has a family. Lyndon's just doing great. But he and Jay have remained really close over the years. And they both have kind of acknowledged basketball just wasn't the same without the other one. Jay gets to the Clippers, and suddenly, for the first time since junior high school, he doesn't have Lyndon Jones in the backcourt with him. And Lyndon, after Jay left IU, stayed at IU for 2 years, but kind of lost his love for the game. Lyndon told me once that as a senior, one of the coaches said, don't you want to play pro ball? Come on, because Lyndon lost some of his love for it. And then I said, not really. Lyndon just kind of saw it as a means to get a college degree and get a good job and everything. And didn't really want to go through the CBA or, G League stuff. But Jay and Lyndon have remained really close. And I think it's a great buddy story in a way, because the direction their lives have gone.
It's a good point. Seeing those two, like you said, playing ball in Marion. And then when Jay left, I remember, I think it was Lyndon's senior year, there were times he didn't play for 2 or 3 games. And I remember when he would get in the game, especially in Bloomington, the crowd would give him a standing ovation.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that vividly. And I remember looking on his face, and I was a young guy then. And I remember saying, man, he doesn't look happy. And that was me sitting in, I don't know where, I think I was in Germany, in the military. I said, he doesn't look happy. And I just felt that way, and I think to your point, when you lose the love for something, you're a little bit lost. And I'm glad he found himself, and good for him. The NBA and that life isn't for everybody. And I'm glad those two have kind of made themselves together, and that's a good thing for them too, for sure.
Yeah. Jay had so much confidence. He never looked nervous, did he? I mean, he had so much confidence. And I remember one story, Woody Austin, or Jay told me, but Woody Austin with Richmond went into Marion for a game, and it's a big game because both teams were good. And Jay hit a last-second shot to win the game. He went over and slapped Woody on the butt. Said, "You didn't think I was going to let you come in here and beat me on my own floor, did you?"
No way.
That kind of thing, that kind of confidence, and that's who Jay was. And that's why he hit all those big shots. He was not nervous. The moment never scared him. He was just a scorer.
Good. So you mentioned the malice, and I was going to chronicle your time with the Pacers from 98 to 06. But I wanted to hit on the malice because I want to tie in to probably my second favorite Pacer in Mel Daniels. But I want to get your take on the malice. It was a Friday night, 2004. I remember saying, these guys are going to win the title. I said, this is a title year. I sat up. I went downstairs because the game was about over, came back upstairs. And just when that happened, that's when I saw Ben doing the Fred Sanford imitation with Ron Artest. So take it from there, my friend.
Yeah, that was a big game. The Pistons had eliminated the Pacers in the playoffs the year before. Pacers had clearly a title contending team with Jermaine O'Neal, Ron Artest. Reggie Miller was on the team but was injured at the time and not playing because he had broken a hand in the preseason. But Tinsley and you go right down the line. They just had a great lineup, and they took it to the Pistons that night. I mean, they dominated that game, and with less than a minute to go, Artest gives that hard foul to Ben Wallace, and Wallace responds and shoves him. And then Artest goes, lays down on the scorer's table. I was about 15 feet from Artest when he was laying on that table, and I just had a bad feeling right then that something was going to happen. He did that because he had been told in anger management counseling to, whenever there's a conflict brewing, remove yourself from it. Physically remove yourself. Walk out of the room. If you're fighting with your wife, walk out of the room or just remove yourself. So he did that, but he made a big show of it. He lays down on that scorer's table. I was afraid that Wallace was trying to get to him to pound him, and I was afraid he's going to do that. Then I also had the feeling that, man, he's a sitting duck for the fans here right behind me. Right. And sure enough, a fan throws a beverage and it hits Artest. What a lot of people don't get is that Artest didn't go crazy and run into the stands and start swinging. He jumped up, grabbed the fan he thought had thrown the beverage and said, "Did you throw that?" And the guy said, No. And he did. He grabbed the wrong fan, and then he turned around and walked back on the floor. But, Ron was the calmest guy in the building at that point. He wasn't going to hit anybody. But then, of course, fans start hitting him, and his teammates go up in the stands, and everything, just all hell breaks loose. And I was just stunned. I'm standing there just watching, not believing what I was seeing, and knew it was going to get ugly for me as the beat writer that, this is going to be a whole lot of extra work because it was going to last a long time.
I didn't sign up for this.
My selfish interest, and trying to keep my laptop dry because all kinds of beverages were flying in the air and all the moisture. But it was just a weird combination of events that created that. Ben Wallace's, I think, brother had just died, and he was on edge. It was his first game back with the team after going to the funeral, and so he was on edge. And Artest shoves him, and he shoves him back. That fans there. There's so many. The referees did not control it. You're taking a butt
whooping. You took a butt whooping. If you took a butt whooping, if you're Detroit, that's paining you.
That too. Yeah. Everything they called a perfect storm, and it was. I thought David Stern overreacted to it. I mean, the fact that that game was on ESPN, nationally televised, so the whole, of course, people would have seen it anyway, even if it was just local TV, they would have seen the clips later, but still that made it worse. And I think Stern realized, I think Artest should have obviously been suspended a long time, but he didn't come down hard enough on Detroit and their lack of crowd control, because fans were just walking on the floor.
Yeah. Remember, Jermaine O'Neal hit the guy as he was coming on the sideline, and Jermaine was on the court. So he got in trouble for it. So to your point, perfect storm.
Yeah.
So now we fast forward. We're going into the locker room, right? And now we see the video of the great Mel Daniels grabbing Artest, taking him in the locker room. My eyes are starting to well up now because how much I think about the great Mel Daniels. Grabbing Ron Artest, treating him like he was his son. Get your blankety blanket. I don't know what he said, but I bet you if it was Mel, it wasn't. Get your nice butt in this locker room, right?
Yeah. Well, I think you're thinking of a different occasion. There's a game in Boston when Artest got kicked out, and that's when Mel grabbed him and took him. Chuck Person got Artest off the floor after the brawl. Remember? But you bring up a good point. Mel was waiting. Artest had gotten kicked out, and somebody, even that game in Boston, somebody threw a beverage on Artest as he's walking off the floor. So he kind of turned around and started yelling, and Mel grabs Artest and grabbed him and got him out of there. But Mel was a special guy. Mel to me was the heart and soul of those championship teams in the ABA. People talk about Roger Brown and other great players, but Mel, two-time league MVP, and he was the guy who would go off in the locker room if the team wasn't performing. He was a guy. Slick Leonard talked about, you want a player-controlled team. You want a team culture where the players coach the team. And Purdue has that now, by the way. Matt Painter talked about that last night, that the players coach the team, the seniors, and they set a standard, and they get on their younger teammates if they're not performing or not trying hard enough. And Mel was that guy, along with Freddie Lewis, for those ABA Pacer championship teams. And Mel was the kind of guy who, he'd fight. He got more fights than any Pacer in franchise history by far. But he was a poet. He'd write poetry. And he was a guy you could sit down and have a real conversation with. Billy Keller told me once that when he was a rookie right out of Purdue, like most rookies, he's not really feeling part of the team yet. And they had a game down and they played at Southern Methodist University, a game, and they walked back to the hotel from the arena, and he and Mel wound up walking back to the hotel together. And Freddie said, from that conversation, for the first time, I felt like a part of the team. And Mel could do that. Mel could have that kind of conversation with a teammate to make them feel part of something, or just have a heartfelt conversation. At the same time, he might go out the next night and punch somebody in the face, on another team. But he had that capability. He part Cherokee Indian. His mom was part Indian, and a genuinely tough guy. And although he was Mel only weighed like 225 pounds, his nickname was Slim. Yeah. But he was really strong and didn't care and would fight you. And more than any of the other Pacers, I think he was the most responsible for their early success.
Two things about Mel, and I'll pivot to a couple others. When you spoke about Mel making you feel good about who you are and what he did for Billy Keller, back in 2012 was my first year as a season ticket holder. We're getting to the game. We're taking the elevator down. Who's getting on the elevator? It's Mel and Darrell. Well, I saw Darrell a lot because I see him at the Pacer camp, so my other son. So I asked Mel, I said, do you mind if I take a picture with you? He talked to me for 5 minutes, and he made me feel like I was doing him a favor by taking a picture. I've got the picture now, and I'll send it to you. And and I was like a kid in a candy store because the way he made me feel, a regular guy he never met in his life, and he made me feel like I was doing him a favor.
Yeah, that's Mel. I believe it totally. He grew up. His dad was a factory worker in Detroit, and his dad had no interest in sports or basketball, and Mel just grew up very humble surroundings, but had a great home situation with his mom and dad. And he didn't, play basketball till like a sophomore year of high school. Never touched the ball. Yeah. And the coach, Will Robinson, major figure in Detroit basketball, literally stopped him in the hallway one day and ordered him to report to the gym and play. And he was terrible at first and became good and got a scholarship, and the rest is history. But he was just a real down-to-earth guy, easy to talk to, and he did a lot of things. Mel was the kind of guy. I heard once that he was after a Pacer game, it was dead of winter, and he saw like a homeless camp. There were a lot of homeless people were under a bridge or whatever. And he stopped and took all the Pacer gear out of his car and was handing it out, and he was the kind of guy who could get really emotional about something like that. I spoke at his funeral service. I know. And it's on YouTube actually. And
I watched it. I promise. I watched every second of it.
Yeah, I read a poem that he wrote. He went to a senior home, an old age home one time, and this what he saw there struck him so much that he wrote a poem about it. And it was great. I mean, Mel had so much depth to his character, and that meant so much to those teams.
Yeah, definitely. And, I'm going to tell you, Mark, I've probably got 3 more hours worth of stuff, but I've got to catch the game tonight. But I want to hit on this. I want to hit on Coach. I want to hit on the great Slick Leonard, what he and Nancy did for this city, this state, this organization. I've been pining to Mark Boyle and anyone who's willing to listen. When are we either going to get a statue of Slick or get that court somehow named Bob Slick Leonard Court something for what he and his wife did for our city? I was 9 years old when they did that telethon. I remember my dad getting a coffee can. He worked at General Motors at the time, and we would go to see the Pacers at the fairgrounds. And he said, let's see what we can do about getting some money for these Pacers. Now, I don't know my blunt from a hole in the ground, but I remember that vividly. So is there talks, and I know the Pacers organization is really strong about not highlighting ex-players as much as some other organizations. Is there any chance a court named after Slick, a statue, or some type of a combination other than just boom baby when we do the new court with the real emblem of the Pacers from the 70s?
I don't know. The statue thing is dicey because once you do it, it's going to raise a lot of questions. What about this guy? Like if you did Slick, people would say, what about Nancy? What about Reggie? What about Mel? It could go on forever. I understand that point. There is a statue of Slick and Reggie at the Children's Museum.
Yeah, sure is.
And I know that's not the same for Pacer fans, but it's a tough call. It's a tough call. I have campaigned for getting Freddie Lewis's jersey number retired and have met resistance with that. And I think they feel like, hey, if we do this, we're going to have half a dozen other people want
Pandora's
to open up
box.
a can of worms, that kind of thing. That's been frustrating for me because to me, it should be obvious that Freddie should have his number retired. Captain of 3 championship teams, MVP of the finals. I mean, all kinds of reasons. And in case of Slick, I'd be fine with it. Now, the practice court is named after him. There's 2 courts over there at the St. Vincent Center. One has Slick's signature, the other has Donnie Walsh's. And there's another guy, Donnie. How do you give him credit? The GM.
He brought the Pacers to that thing, right? When he came on board, he really saw something. And good point. I guess being a historian and being a kid of the 70s, which is why I speak about the Slick situation.
Yeah.
Anytime I see him at the game, he'd had his tennis shoes on, going to smoke a cigarette, and he's always say, "Hey, bud, how you doing?"
Yeah.
You know, you didn't know my name or anybody or anything else, but he always made a point to say hello to you.
Slick and Nancy both were the most down-to-earth people you could imagine. And yeah, I would watch Pacer games from the broadcast area, that porch up there halfway up. And he would always go out there and smoke a cigarette or chew his nicotine gum at halftime and mix with everybody. You know, no ego hangups whatsoever. You know, I've read stories where Slick would drive somewhere to somebody, you know, he came out with a book and somebody would say they wanted a copy signed and everything, and Slick would drive somewhere and meet him and give it to him, you know, that kind of thing. Or he would go to the trouble of mailing, somebody from another country would want an autograph or whatever, and he would go to the trouble of going to the post office and figuring out the postage. And, you know, I mean, he and Nancy both extremely down-to-earth people, you know, Indiana people. Slick grew up very humble surroundings himself. And that's just true they were. And I would not be opposed to any form of honoring them, but I do recognize how it opens up a big can of worms. You know, it kind of depends how old they are. You know, a younger fan would say, "What about Reggie?" You know, right? And someday they're going to say that about, "What about Halliburton?" And
they will. They'll say that too for sure. And that's a good point. You know, from my age group, I don't think about that, right? I think about what Slick did and that impact, because if not, and my thinking is this, Mark, and I'll end with this: if not for Slick and Nancy, you and I aren't talking. We're not looking at Gaber's Life Fieldhouse, and that's what kind of gets the nostalgia, right?
Yeah.
But I can understand, because we've got to look at and placate to not just those 70s and 80s kids. We got to, you know, it's the 2010s and the 20s alike. So makes a good point, and that's appreciated for sure. Mark, I just got to tell you, you know, I got your book. I'm going to read every page. I promise you.
All right.
And I just want you to know, I'm also going to subscribe to your webpage. I'm going to subscribe to that. And I want to thank you for your time. It was more than I've ever could have imagined. I probably got, like I said, probably another 3 or 4 hour worth of Pacer stuff I want to hit, but I know your time is important. But I want to definitely share with you. We've got, you know, our sponsors, Matt Gaddis of State Farm, obviously Pike High School graduate. He's done a great job in supporting the Game Time Network. Without Mac and his support, I've known Mac for about 25 years. You wouldn't be talking to me without Mac. He's been that good of a friend. And when I mentioned you, he did light up like a Christmas tree. And the first thing he said, you know, he went to Pike.
Yeah. I'm a 1973 Pike graduate.
Yeah.